Hello, testing. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on academic freedom, empirical data on a contested idea. My name is Janila Gonzalez. I'm an assistant professor here of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Just a few logistical announcements to get us started. First, the Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Our discussion today is being recorded and it's going to be available on the Ash Center's YouTube page. So as a result, we would like to ask that all remarks, including those questions from the audience, be spoken into the microphone to facilitate the audio for the recording. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsor for today's discussion, the Carr Center for Human Rights here at the Kennedy School, as well as to Professor Katrin Kinzelbach, who was the catalyst of this wonderful conversation today. This is our inaugural seminar of a new series that my colleague Gautam and I are co-organizing called Global Challenges to Democracy. Obviously, recent global events, whether you're following, what recent events in Ecuador or obviously ongoing violence in Israel and Gaza, there are numerous challenges into the present day democratic governments around the world. And so we're going to host a lot of exciting speakers, starting with Katrin today, that will shed light on various processes that pose challenges to democracy around the world. So we're really excited to get started with something that is both close to home of those of us here at a university, but also with many global implications. So I'll turn it over to my colleague Gautam to tell us a little bit more about today's event.
Awesome. Thanks, Anilda. So I'm Gautam Nair. I'm an assistant professor here at the Kennedy School. Like many of you, I also worry a lot about democracy. And this series is partly an effort to do something fun with Anilda, but also more importantly, to develop new and better ideas about democracy so that all the progress that we've made in the last few decades is not washed away. And we also obviously need robust debate. So I hope that in the spirit of today's talk, that we all have plenty of disagreements rather than too much agreement. And before I turn to Katrin to introduce today's speaker, I also wanted to invite you all to our next event in the series, which is scheduled for Tuesday, October 24th at 4 p.m. We'll have Consuelo Amat, who's a terrific scholar from Johns Hopkins, who will give a presentation titled Training Activists in Nonviolent Action Increases Self-Efficacy and Reduces Violence. It's really interesting work, so I hope you'll join. You will be able to find more details and a link to register at the Ash Center's website and in an email you'll receive following the conclusion of today's talk. So with that, let me hand the floor to our moderator, Katrin Kinzelbach, who is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at HKS. Professor Kinzelbach has written widely and influentially on international norms and institutions, transnational advocacy networks, the impact of human rights law and policies, and transitional justice. Her award-winning books include The Hidden Face of Rights Towards a Politics of Responsibilities, Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work in the 21st Century, and The Justice Cascade, how human rights prosecutions are changing world politics. She's a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Council on Foreign Relations. So thank you very much, Katrin.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's event. And I think it's really appropriate to start a series on democracy, to start talking about that issue, freedom of speech and academic freedom. It's related concept of academic freedom, which is so essential, as we know, to a democracy. And we're very excited to have today as our speaker, Katrin Kinzelbach. Katrin is formerly the Professor of International Politics and Human Rights at the Friedrich-Alexander-University, which is at Nuremberg and Erlangen. And I have had the opportunity to visit her university, and she has started a human rights program there. It's a very important place to have a major human rights program set in the city of Nuremberg, where the historic Nuremberg trials were held. And so today, she will be discussing academic freedom from a human rights perspective. She is a major scholar of human rights And I should say she's also has worked not only at a number of universities besides the University of Nuremberg, but she's also worked at the United Nations. She was at the UN Development Program, where she served in various duty stations around the world between 2001 and 2007. She also frequently, so for those of us at the Kennedy School, we're very interested in this nexus between research and policy making. And Katrin's a good example of someone who's really had a foot in both of those worlds and still does advise policymakers in Germany, the European Union, and the UN. But today in particular, she's talking about, not about her work, her important work that she's done on political prisoners in the world. So I wonder if you might say a few words about the link between political prisoners and freedom of speech and academic freedom. But today she's going to talk about a project that she's taken on working with an important data book called VDEM, where she is conceptualizing this academic freedom index, which provides worldwide data on academic freedom around the world. So this is really a comparative analysis of all the countries of the world on the issue of academic freedom. So we also are really fortunate to have as our discussant someone many of you know, Professor Tarek Masoud. So I would say he needs no introduction, but I still will give him one, a brief one. And that is that he's the Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Governance at the Kennedy School, co-editor of the Journal for Democracy, and he is the faculty director of the Middle East Initiative, as well as Initiative on Democracy in Hard Places. And certainly some of the work that Katrin has done is very much about academic freedom in hard places. With that, I just want to turn it over to Katrin and get us started. Then we'll have, after that, we'll have remarks from Professor Masoud, and we will make time, and I'm in charge of time, to make sure we'll have time for all of your questions and comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's also a very difficult time, so I appreciate you all making time for this event today. Academic freedom, as has already been mentioned, is of course core to the democratic project. It's also about all of us. It's about the conditions under which we work. I want to start by highlighting that academic freedom has long been an idea, continues to be a contested idea. There are probably three main strands of debate. The first being about the rights holders. Who can claim academic freedom? Is this a professional privilege that you gain after many years of training and specialization? So is this only for tenured professors, or can all members of the academy claim academic freedom? And the second debate is around what are the protected activities? Is this really only about freedom of expression, about critical speech, or are there also activities that fall a little bit outside of the remit of speech rights, right? Organization of scientific endeavors, collaboration across borders. And then the infringements. What counts as an infringement? Is that only state repression, or are there other pressures on the academy that count as an infringement of academic freedom? I would say that my talk here today will not give you definitive answers on any of these questions, hopefully some food for thought. But my main argument is that despite all these debates about the specific remits of academic freedom, at least democratic actors can and have agreed on a core of the concept that we can monitor empirically. And on top of that, there is a binding international law coming from the human rights instruments that states have committed to that we should also be able to monitor. And I want to introduce some of those human rights concepts before I move to our data. I talk a little bit about academic freedom in the context of human rights law. Then I introduce the Academic Freedom Index, which is our measure, a global measure of the state of academic freedom around the world. I want to point to some variation over time. We often hear academic freedom deteriorates, but as a political scientist, I want to know, is that really true? What's the evidence, right? And how much is it deteriorating? Is this a global trend or is this not a global trend? I'll point you to some countries that have actually improved academic freedom in the last 5 years, and then many more countries that have actually. I want to finish with a few thoughts on academic freedom and democracy. Okay, so when we talk about academic freedom from a human rights perspective, I actually want to take you back to the beginning debates at the United Nations. Seems like a long time ago, but I think we can learn a lot from those debates. And this occurred in a context where states had, and the people around the world had just survived 2 world wars. The horror of the Holocaust was an important impetus for the entire human rights project. The 2 atomic bombs that exploded over Japan have shown to the world that actually science is not only a force for good. Science can be a cause of severe trouble for the human people, right? And so in this context, when academic freedom and the role of science in the context of human rights was discussed at the United Nations, the Soviet Union suggested that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should actually state that science must be directed towards the progress of mankind, the cause of peace, and cooperation amongst people. They also later suggested, the Soviet Union, science should be directed towards democracy. Now, the United States immediately countered this argument and said, under no circumstances would they agree that science be placed at the service of politics. And I brought a few more quotes from that time because that highlights that it was not only a debate between the Soviet Union and the United States about the role of science in society. There were some states that sided with the Soviet Union, trying to respond to the horrors of their time. I should also add, and you mentioned Nuremberg, that while these debates were going on in Nuremberg, the Nuremberg doctors' trials were happening. So it was at the forefront of people's mind at that time that science could bring great perils to society. Nevertheless, the majority of state representatives at the time insisted that science be free from political constraints. And the arguments put forward came from different states. Venezuela argued that this could justify the persecution of scientists for political reasons. And here's exactly where scientists can also become political prisoners. Lebanon argued that the Soviet proposal actually confused the aims of science with its accidental results. Saudi Arabia said, actually, it would take generations to determine whether research contributed to progress or not. Belgium said, it is not for human rights to decide what the purpose of science is, but if it had to be done, it should be the search for truth. And relatively late, and you can find all of that in the Travaux Préparatoires for the Universal Declaration, Peru argued sequentially that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should not only mention the right to participate in the arts and sciences, but should actually highlight the right to do so in that complete freedom without which there could be no creation worthy of man. So instead of making an instrumentalist argument, we need academic freedom because that supports scientific progress or economic development or democracy. Peru pointed to the dignity of the human person engaged in the creative scientific process. Later, we found this idea of academic freedom also introduced into binding law. Actually, 171 states around the world have ratified a covenant where they specifically commit to respecting the freedom indispensable for scientific research. Not a single country has filed a reservation on this article. I think this is strong evidence that we actually have a global commitment to academic freedom at state level. In addition, we have the second treaty on civil and political rights, where states commit to upholding freedom of expression, which includes the freedom to share information, right? So we take this, despite all the contestation, as a sort of starting point, saying that if we have this kind of commitment, we can monitor whether states actually comply with this commitment. And what is important, I think, for our discussion later is that in a sort of more detailed comment by an independent committee on economic, social, and cultural rights set up by the UN with representatives, again, from all of the world's region, they highlighted not only that states need to respect academic freedom, so a negative obligation on states not to intervene in the scientific enterprise, but that states also had a duty to protect researchers from undue influence on their independent judgment, so arguably protecting them against corrosive influence of third parties. Right? We have more details there on what the freedom covers. It's the freedom to set up autonomous research institutions, to define the aims and objectives of the research, to withdraw from projects where you have ethical concerns, to cooperate nationally and internationally, and also to share data. So this actually goes a little bit into a different direction from purely looking at freedom of speech. It shows you that there are a multi-dimensional concept behind this idea of the freedom of science or academic freedom. Right? And these are not the only documents. There are a number of additional soft law documents that I will skip now for the reasons of time. But my main argument is we have had a long discussion in human rights circles on the importance of academic freedom and quite some agreement on what the components are. So we took this debate looking at what human rights law has to offer us, but also scanning the academic debate on academic freedom to identify 5 dimensions of the concept. So it's a multi-dimensional concept. What are its dimensions? We identify 5. We assess the freedom to research and teach, the freedom of academic exchange and dissemination, but also 2 more institutional dimensions. Institutional autonomy means that universities can handle their affairs without interference from external actors. We have an indicator that is called campus integrity, which basically means absence of externally induced fear and intimidation. And then the more traditional freedom of academic and cultural expression. I should highlight that this 5th indicator was already part of the VDEM project, and I'll talk more about the VDEM project in a moment, before we developed the index. And when you look at the detailed codebook, it's the only indicator that actually specifies freedom from state interference, right? The other 4 indicators speak more broadly about undue influence by non-academic actors. That could include advocacy groups, that could include companies, that could include religious organizations, not only the state. When we started working on this index, this was 2017, so a while ago, we did reach out to a number of stakeholders, also advocacy groups, worked very closely with the Scholars at Risk networks, because we wanted to make sure that the data, once that it's out there, is not only useful for academic research, but also for policy making. And in fact, Scholars at Risk as an advocacy group was very supportive of the project, but also said, we have to have the best available academic data, because not only will there be critics to negative ratings, but we actually expect the scholarly community itself to be very critical of the data, right? So if you want to have an index on academic freedom, you must be sure that you can convince also the academic community. I'm not sure whether we succeed in that. That's for you to judge. And I welcome your critical comments later. But I do think we found a great partner in the VDEM Institute, which is one of the largest social science data collection efforts in the world right now. The data set is around 430 indicators, so we have 5 of those, and I have had the opportunity of working with the VDEM Institute on the index, and they allow us to work on what we recognize is a latent variable. So academic freedom is not a variable that you can directly measure, right? But it is a latent variable that escapes direct observation, which means it's very, very challenging to assess it. And after considering various alternatives, we settled on using expert assessments for the index. Now, expert assessments are great in many ways. You can build on local expertise. You can expect your experts to contextualize information, but it comes with a number of problems, right? Experts have different levels of access to information. They might have different scale perception. They might be biased. So the VDEM project is known for being the best currently available model for aggregating expert assessments in a meaningful way. They basically, the idea is that each expert gives a specific rating, and that is an imperfect manifestation of an unobservable concept, right? And they build a statistical model that allows not only for a useful aggregation of the various experts' assessment, but also for the calculation of the most likely point estimate, and very important, an estimate of uncertainty. So how sure are we that academic freedom is declining in a particular country? What if the coders disagree? What do we make of that, right? I will happily answer questions on the methodology, but I think what you need to keep in mind is that this model allows us to adjust for different scale perceptions that coders might have, and to also assess the certainty of the point estimates. What does that mean in practice, right? So we work with roughly 2,200 coders around the world. On average per country year, we have 9.3, I believe, or yeah, 9.3 coders. They get presented with a number of questions on these indicators and an ordinal scale with specific response options and a lot of definitions on the various concepts. And then they have to assess for a particular country and a particular year, how well is academic freedom protected? And actually, no, that's not what they're being asked, that the specific indicator. So here I brought freedom to research and teach. And we then combine the indicators to get a sense of what academic freedom looks like. We asked them actually to look at restrictions across all disciplines. We have consciously chosen not to separate disciplines. For social scientists, maybe that's surprising because we know that social sciences are particularly prone to interference. Maybe it would be interesting to show that. But we were actually worried that governments that may leave the natural sciences relatively free could use such data in order to, promote the degree of academic freedom in their country. And so we basically decided that any attack on any discipline is an attack on academic freedom. Okay, and so this is what the state of the world looks like from an academic freedom perspective. According to our latest update, it's called Update 2023, but this year is not over. So what you see there is this year's assessment of last year's academic freedom. And the violet is the best rating, and the darker red means it's more negative. Right? What is really interesting about the data is not only that it can show you how does the world look like today, but coders actually are asked to go back in time. So we have some sense of how are things changing. And here is a chart that provides an answer to the question of whether academic freedom has deteriorated. We show data here in the middle in this pink field. using a global average from the 1960s to today. The dark line is the most likely point estimate, but you can also see there's a fairly large confidence interval, right? Margin of error. What we do see very clearly is that the democratization in the 1990s led to a significant improvement of academic freedom. On the left side, for you also on the left side, that's a country-based average, right? The decline in recent years is really within the confidence bounds. So it could be a statistical noise, right? When we talk about country-based global average. When you take an alternative perspective and say, well, I'm actually interested in population-weighted data, how many people are affected by these declines? It looks different. You see a statistically significant decline in the last few years when you take a population-weighted average. That means a lot of people in the world, in fact, more than 50% of the world's population live in countries where we have statistically significant declines in academia. And these countries are visible in the slide. Everything below the diagonal line is a deterioration comparing last year's data to the data of 2012. And the size of the dots gives you an indication of country size. So we have quite a few large dots there, right? We have some countries deteriorating like the United States at a fairly high level. They remain at a very high level. And then we have other countries like China that have deteriorated from an already very low level to an even lower level since Xi Jinping took over. There are 22 countries in total that actually, where we find a statistically significant decline. So that's the bad news. We do have some countries, 5 of them, where we have also found an improvement. I do think we should talk more about those countries where we actually see an improvement of academic freedom. Unfortunately, less than 1% of the world's population lives in these countries. Now, academic freedom, of course, tends to be not very well protected in autocracies. That shouldn't come as a surprise, right? But what we do find is that democracies are not immune to declines in academic freedom. I think this is something we may want to discuss. Why is that? How do we explain that? Part of the explanation are autocratization processes. So here you see the lower lines, I think in blue and red, are Hungary and India. Both of these countries no longer qualify as democracies according to VDEM data, but have deteriorated into what we call electoral autocracies. So countries where elections still take place, but they're not free and fair. And in those countries, academic freedom has also deteriorated significantly. But the other 2 countries, Mexico and the United States, obviously are still democracies. Academic freedom is still declining in these countries. I brought here, and I know Tarek knows quite a lot about Egypt too, so I just picked Egypt as a comparison for the United States, being very different countries, of course, but 2 of our decliners. And what is interesting to me here is that the pattern of decline is very different. Actually, our data suggests that the freedom of academic and cultural expression remains well protected against state interference in the United States. Whereas the other 4 indicators, where we look more broadly at the influence of non-academic actors on the academy, those are declining, right? In Egypt, on the other hand, the freedom of academic and cultural expression, the vulnerability of academics, is what declines most. So I do think that's an authoritarian feature, right? Democracies can't survive if the state starts to interfere dramatically in freedom of expression. But universities can still suffer from declining schools. Now, I want to finish with just a few thoughts. Academic freedom, I'm sure you know that from your discussions, is contested. and will continue to be contested on the margins of the concept. But at the core of the concept, I think we have a consensus of what needs to be protected, and human rights law provides us a de jure standard. Now, the Academic Freedom Index, I believe, I try to argue, and I'm very happy to hear your criticism and also maybe answer questions, provides reliable estimates of the de facto situation that can be used both for research and for advocacy. I should report that 2 of the countries with declining scores, India and also Mexico, actually reached out and complained about their scores, trying to argue that those scores were wrong, and we take this as an indication that they take notice. And so maybe that's good. But I think there's still much to learn about academic freedom, and certainly the answer to those declines is still to be formulated. So I'm glad for the opportunity to discuss this with you today in the context of the Global Challenges to Democracy seminar series. Maybe my final line would be, academic freedom needs democracy, but democracy also needs academic.
Just take 1 minute before I pass it on, because I realized I forgot to mention that this event is also co-sponsored by the Carr Center for Human Rights. And so and the Carr Center this year is having a series of events celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. So even though Katrin didn't even know that we're doing this, she helped us out by mentioning the sources of this academic freedom right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago. So thank you for fitting into our agenda on that. I also wanted to point out that I was just looking in the audience, I know we have colleagues from Mexico and from India, and I'm sure you will get some good questions on that. So let me pass it over to Professor Masoud.
Great, thank you. That was really a great talk, Professor Kinzelbach. I think this is a really important data collection enterprise, and I'm already trying to think of ways that we can use some of this extraordinary data in our work. So I just want to say a couple of things. So I was asked to participate in this event a couple of weeks ago, and my plan was, I tend to over-prepare for my public presentations, and my plan was to prepare for this on the plane back from Bosnia on Monday. And then, of course, as you all know, the part of the world that I'm most obsessed with has sort of blown up. And so these remarks are a little bit more off the cuff than I typically do, but I hope you'll forgive me. So I think the lesson I take away from your data is really that the greatest threat to academic freedom is dictatorship. And it's not surprising, obviously, but it's nonetheless very important to document. When I think about my own life, when I told my mother when I was a sophomore in college that I thought I wanted to maybe become a writer of some kind instead of a doctor or an engineer, she said, well, then you're never going to be able to come back to the Middle East, The reason being that, of course, in our part of the world, there is no academic freedom. You cannot, or no freedom of speech. You cannot be somebody who makes their living arguing or sharing ideas and expect to live a life unmolested. And when I became a political scientist, I remember that I was very consciously deciding that I was never going to live the world again. And it was consequently a kind of bittersweet decision for me. Now, recent events in our country here in the United States reveal that even though I think your data is broadly correct, that the greatest threat to academic freedom is dictatorship, as you note, there are threats to academic freedom within democracies. And in some democracies, that threat to academic freedom comes from what we typically associate or call democratic backsliding. So these are democracies that are kind of becoming more authoritarian. So Turkey is a classic example of this. It was a democracy, it is now a dictatorship. As its democracy declined, I'm sure academic freedom declined as well. Today, of course, there is no academic freedom in Turkey, but there was a moment where Turkey would have showed up in your data as democratic with declines in academic freedom. So when would-be autocrats want to limit the space for opposition and gather all the threads of power in their hands, one of their first targets, of course, is the academy. And so I think that's obviously what drives a lot of the decline in academic freedom in democracies. However, those of us who are professors here at places like Harvard, particularly those of us who may have heterodox views, also feel a decline in academic freedom in a place like the United States, where I don't think you could make the claim that there is any real autocratization process. There may be things happening at the state level where this or that governor is trying to limit the expression of this or that view, but we really can't say the U.S. is undergoing any kind of autocratization, and yet I think academics are beginning to feel very squeezed in terms of what they can and cannot say. And I think that it would probably be correct to define some of these fears as coming from, or some of the pressures rather, that limit academic freedom as not coming from the state, not coming from would-be autocrats, but really coming from our students, coming from pressure groups in society, and coming from institutions, the institutions that we work for, which I think are, very well-meaning institutions. These are institutions that are doing the Lord's work, but they are nonetheless fearful of running afoul of conventional wisdom. Nobody wants to be dragged on social media for this or that opinion. Nobody wants to have their institution labeled with some pejorative. And so I think that's a major concern. And certainly it's one of the things I constantly find myself getting annoyed about. But I also think, so I think it would be easy for me to stop there and say what we really need to focus on is giving our institutions some backbone, so that when pressure groups show up and say, hey, I don't like that Tariq Masood argued that the earth is flat. I'm just kidding. I don't think the earth is flat. That's the one sane view I have. That the institution should have some backbone and say, look, he's allowed to argue whatever he wants as long as he's, doing his job. That's, academic freedom. I think instead of stopping there, I want us to confront the role that we as academics are playing in the erosion of our own academic freedom. So last year I did an edited volume with Scott Mainwaring, who's a great scholar of democracy. And what we did in this book is we looked at examples, it's called Democracy in Hard Places. And what we looked at, everybody around the world is worried about the established democracies failing. We said, you know what, let's try to tell a more hopeful story. Let's look at places that shouldn't be democracies because they're poor, they have high rates of ethnic fragmentation, illiteracy, et cetera, and yet they are democracies. What's going on in those places that enables them to transcend the grim fate that is written for them in their socioeconomic characteristics? And the argument that emerged from this book, which brought together several scholars who chronicled examples of unlikely democracies, the lesson that we took from this is that, one of the things that's really important for the survival of democracy is having political elites, political leaders, the people who had political parties, the people who had labor unions, the head of the army. They all have to have a normative commitment to democracy. They all have to think, you know what, I want policy X or Y, but I want democracy more. So if it's a choice between getting my policy desiderata and having democracy, I'm always going to choose democracy, even if it means I don't get my policy desiderata. And I would argue with Scott. Scott really loves this idea. I kind of like the idea. And I would argue with him, where does this come from, et cetera. But in case after case after case of these democracies in hard places, you see places that face real challenges. There's a moment where the democracy might fail, and yet political elites put democracy first. I think one of the problems that we have in the academy is that people like me, academics, I'm not sure we have the normative commitment to academic freedom. In other words, this lexicographical ordering of preferences where academic freedom comes first, where I say, I may not like what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So this event is being recorded. I may try to convince Melissa to cut this part, but so I think we're experiencing this right now at Harvard. A couple of days ago, or I think it was just yesterday, actually, it feels like a couple of days ago, some student groups at Harvard issued a statement basically assigning blame for the spectacular violence in somebody looks like they're recording me on their phone. I hope they're not. Turn it off. The spectacular violence in southern Israel to Israel. The first sentence of the statement was, "We blame Israel for all the violence." And I remember reading this and thinking, these students are just full of vinegar and anger and the righteous anger that is characteristic of people between the ages of 18 and 22. Obviously, if I were the parent of any one of these students, I would have said, you are completely free to believe what you want, but could you have some decency and first begin by decrying and mourning the loss of life? I would have taken, and in fact, I know some of these students, I would have taken them aside and argued with them about the position. Some of our colleagues, people who I know to be deeply committed to academic freedom, were so angry about this statement of the students, which, by the way, I will go on record and say, I think was a stupid statement. I disagree with said. But they were so angry with the statement of the students that they demanded that the university disavow the students. And my view is that is exactly what we should not do. Because I live in fear, actually, of the university disavowing me for things that I say in the classroom. So we cannot say, I want academic freedom for me, but not for thee. What we should be saying is, look, you students are perfectly free to say what you want to say. I'm going to go on Twitter and say that you were wrong. But what I am not going to do is demand that the institution somehow throw its weight behind silencing you. And I will hope, and I will try to teach you in the classroom, that you should offer me the same courtesy. That when I get in front of the classroom and I say the violence is completely the fault of Hamas, that the Palestinians have agency, they could have chosen an alternative path, you should not ask the university to sanction me because I have somehow caused harm or violence with my words. So I wonder if this tremendous, extraordinary research enterprise that you have undertaken can help us in its future iterations actually measure some of the underlying commitment to academic freedom of the people who should be defending it most. Thank you.
We are going to have time for opening it to the audience. We'll do that very soon. I just want to ask you first, Katrin, whether you want to have just a first response to these very interesting remarks.
Yeah, thank you for your remarks. And I completely agree on this underlying commitment that needs to be practiced more. We also need to teach it. We all learn how to cite articles. But who of you has had introductions to academic freedom when you first started university? I didn't. I know of very few people who have had explicit introductions to these ideas and why it is so important for university. We can do better on that, and we have to do better. I think our index does, at least in 4 of the indicators, look at external actors, and we include externally appointed university leadership, for example. There's a whole debate on the marketization of universities as driving also restrictions of academic freedom. Whether it sufficiently does justice to the dynamics that you have described, I think is something we need to debate. But I would also remind you that an effort to actually map all countries in the world on one scale has the challenge of maybe not sufficiently showing differences on the both extremes of the spectrum. If you are saying the index may not adequately address these dynamics, that would imply the US score is even worse than it already is. I'm not sure that would make sense in comparative perspective, right? I do want to highlight the one thing where I disagree. I think we need to be careful not to equate academic freedom with freedom of opinion. Academic freedom does not protect any kind of speech. So even if you believe the earth were flat, then unless you can put forward some scientific arguments for that, academic freedom is not the right that protects you from making such utterances. Freedom of opinion is. And I do think that the example that you have given and that I've also read about the Harvard students expressing themselves on the situation in Israel and Palestine is an exercise of freedom of opinion, but is not an exercise of academic freedom. The freedom of opinion dimension in academic freedom is typically defined as members of the academy should be free to express themselves on the system in which they work. So should express opinions, for example, on the quality of the university leadership, could be on the quality of, the political system and the extent to which it facilitates academic work. All other utterances that we should also welcome as Democrats, protected under freedom of opinion, where students and professors have no more rights than any other citizen in our countries to express themselves freely.
That and I know Tarek will want to jump in maybe, but we're going to open it up. We're going to ask people to find a mic. There, Melissa has a mic, so raise your hands, identify yourself, and I think we'll probably take a round of 3 or so, maybe 4 questions, and then come back to the 2 of you.
Hi, my name is Saravya, and I was wondering if you could talk about the impact of, if you know at all about transnational repression on academic freedom. So like in 2021, there was this Dismantling Global Hindutva conference in the United States, which was about Hindu nationalism. And then the Indian government and its like agents, the IT cell, they like viciously attacked, like they sent thousands of emails to the presidents of the universities. There was a lot of like death threats, all kinds of threats like you can't come back to India, all this stuff. So like a lot of the academics ended up dropping out of the conference because of that, and they had to adopt like very severe protections. So I was just wondering if you took that into account in your research at all.
Go ahead. I saw you, Nilda had her hand up. Yes, this gentleman right here.
Okay. Actually, just a quick comment first on the freedom of opinion. Sorry, my name is Alex Verne. I'm from MIT down the road. Traditionally in the US, academic freedom has been taken to protect, extramural speech on the part of faculty members. So it does include protection of freedom of opinion. I had a question about the the indexes of the US compared to Europe, in particular the UK. If I saw the screen correctly, Europe gets a slightly higher rating than the US, and I wondered whether you thought that was a real difference, having some experience of both the US and the UK universities. That seems to be a somewhat surprising result to me. I wouldn't have thought the UK would have scored higher than the US.
Well, I guess I'll go next. I just first 2 quick questions. First is, what do you, maybe I'd love to hear from all 3 of you, the role of technology in some of this. Just a couple of hot off the presses on our junior faculty WhatsApp group. We're just sort of sharing some accounts that students have shared of apparently there's some doxing that's going on, truck going around to campus showing the names and photos of students that have signed. Maybe it was the same letter that Tarek referenced. And students suffering consequences for things they've posted on social media. So obviously, I think you would say that this falls outside of academic freedom. I think Tarek might disagree, but just what might we think about? Obviously, professors, researchers are using social media a lot to disseminate research findings outside of traditional peer-reviewed publications. So what might the role of technology be in some of this? And the second question is, I wonder what is that line between freedom of opinion and academic freedom? Because obviously the example that Tarek mentioned, it concerns the classroom, right? And what we say in the classroom. And and the like. But we've also seen, for example, in a place like Texas and even in Florida, right, challenging of departments that teach critical race theory or gender studies, ethnic studies, and the like, right? And so these begin with opinions, but they come to implicate eventually some of the more formal components of academic freedom down the road. So we'd love to hear you all opine about that.
Oh, there's one more question here, so we'll take the fourth, and then we'll turn back to the.
Thank you. Jeff Williams. I'm an alumnus of Harvard and a fellow at the Roger Wiley Institute. I'm on the board of trustees of a foundation that facilitates and funds collaborations in medical research, medical education in that biggest country with a dark red on your map. And there's a lot of debate in this country right now that any form of academic engagement with that country ought to be stopped, whether it be on national security grounds or on IP protection grounds. It's a variety of arguments, but the thing right now, there's a lot of pressure, and our Congress is doing hearings on questions like this. Just be is the role of a academically free society in engaging with societies that are not academically free? What are the pros and cons of that?
Hey, thank you. Great questions. I think I will take the first and the last one together, because transnational repression is also a phenomenon that we can observe in the case of China. I think the example that you gave is India. Now, I would say that our index is not sensitive enough to, because we are talking about, country averages, to really give any useful data on specific phenomena of this kind. In other work, with other kind of data, I have worked on transnational repression involving China. And this is, of course, an area where we can also observe autocratic learning. I mean, there is definitely an effort made to control individuals who are abroad and to make sure and enlist them in state-sponsored propaganda and to terrify them when they're abroad, right? And that, I would say, means that universities have a responsibility to do the best they can to make the space comparatively safe for scholars and students from those countries. I choose careful words because I recognize that they don't have effective control. Right? So they can do their best, they should do their best, but we can't be so naive to think that any arrangements you make, for example, by outlawing the digital recording of discussions or something like that, you automatically have a solution to the problem. You don't. Transnational repression in the academic field is real. We need to work on it. We need to try and reduce the risk, but without also coming at the service of the autocrats. For example, as professors, we need to be very careful to inform students about risks also in the classroom, but we shouldn't intimidate them to the extent that we basically ask for their self-censorship. So it's a very, very difficult, and I'm sure you have experience about this as well, so I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that. Should this now mean that we stop all academic collaboration with countries where we know such dynamics exist? Well, in the case of China, and we also have a debate on this in Europe, I think that can't be the question, because in some disciplines, they are so advanced that if we want to be involved in the scientific progress, we better be open to learning from their knowledge, right? Times are over where it's a sort of one-sided transmission of knowledge. So the decoupling is in the academic field is no option, and it goes contrary to the idea of knowledge production as a global public good, right? It also goes contrary to academic freedom, which involves the freedom of researchers to cooperate nationally and internationally. Now, there are some areas where states can legitimately curtail collaboration, notably when it touches national security. Right? And there is legislation in the US and Europe on, for example, the transmission of dual-use technology that is forbidden, right? And that can be legitimately also be prohibited. We have to be very careful, though, not to securitize the academic space. There have been some policy proposals which I would argue go counter to the idea of academic freedom. For example, ideas that professors should report suspicions on student informants in the classroom. Now, this is outside of any law concept. If we now start to spy on our students reporting suspicions of some of them being informants, So we have to be very, very careful that the sort of state security apparatus doesn't place duties on universities which fall completely outside of the remit of universities. On freedom of speech, of course, extramural speech is also protected. But again, I would argue not any kind of speech. If I present academic research results on a TV show, right? That's protected by academic freedom. If I speak there about some political topic of the day and I voice my opinions as a citizen, I can claim freedom of expression like any citizen in the country. But that's not a case of academic freedom. And I feel rather passionate about trying to differentiate between the two, because why really should academics have more freedom of expression if it's not related to their specific field of expertise than any normal citizen, right? I don't agree with the notion that the professional status should give you more of a say over political procedures, unless you have specific expertise that you can contribute. And being a social scientist and a political scientist, we can obviously claim quite a lot of expertise on many political issues. So maybe it's convenient for me to say. I do think that the whole sphere of social media and technology is the one element which we have to really figure out today. The historical examples that I gave you are not really instructive, because this was not a phenomenon they had to deal with at the time. We have in our examples also intimidation in digital platforms as one, what we say, external threat to the academy. Here you see that the lines might not be so clear, because students and other members of the academy could participate in such campaigns on social media that try to intimidate scholars and other students. So this is maybe an area where we need more thinking and also more specific data in order to make sense of the situation. And the last example that was discussed with Florida, I mean, these are classic examples of state infringements of institutional autonomy. The universities are the ones to decide what kind of courses should be on offer, programs, right? The individual scholars in those programs should be free to teach to the best of their abilities, and it should not be the state limiting institutional autonomy.
Of course, yes, I was just going to turn to you.
Thank you so much. First, just on Professor Gonzalez's question about the role of technology, I don't have anything original to say about sort of how the internet has basically given everybody a platform both to share their ideas and to be exposed to withering criticism. When I was on Twitter, I got canceled. I can't remember why, but when I was on Twitter, it was certainly one of the least enjoyable parts of it was just random people telling you you're a terrible person because you expressed a fairly anodyne view. But I don't necessarily have for me, somebody driving a truck around Harvard Square with the names of people who signed a petition that nobody likes. Like, my view is, it's perfectly appropriate for them to do that. That's their speech. You went out and made a statement. People can say that your statement is terrible. Where I think there gets to be a violation is if the institution somehow takes action as a result of that. What the institution should just do is like, well, this happens, So that brings me really to this distinction between freedom of speech and academic freedom, which I just don't buy. I don't even know why you're passionate about it. You shouldn't be. Find something else to be passionate about. I'll tell you why. Actually, I'll tell you why. I think actually to make the best argument for your position, you actually are saying the freedom of speech is absolute. It should be guaranteed for everybody. No, okay, then I can't even defend your position. So here's what I was trying to construct a defensible position for you, but I will stop trying to do that, and I'll just say how I view it. Let's say I work for CVS, and I have expressed some view about, say, IQ differences between men and women at the tail end, like a former president of Harvard once did. And somebody sees my Twitter feed where I say this, and there's all kinds of opprobrium that CVS gets for hiring a misogynist. I'm not sure that it's such a problem if CVS says, we just hired you to be a good cashier, and you're doing this, you're creating all kinds of problems for us. So I'm sorry, yes, you have freedom of speech. You're not going to go to jail for saying what you said, but you can't work for us because you're costing us money. For an academic institution, my right to say things is intrinsic to the job. So the academic institution shouldn't have that right. Okay, the academic institution, Harvard can't come to me and say, hey, Tarek, you have this view, and consequently, we'd like it if you left. I think that's the to the extent that I don't know that there's a distinction. I just think academic institutions are duty bound to protect the freedom of speech of their members. And I don't think it matters one iota if it's the academic is staying in their lane. Okay, maybe yes, I got tenure because I'm a political scientist, but down the line I want to do research on climate change. That's the deal. I should get to do that as long as I'm doing that in the context of university. That I think should be protected. And so I'm open to being wrong, but I can't understand why you don't buy that. Finally, on this point about engaging with authoritarian countries. So in my other world, my other life, I spend a lot of time engaging with authoritarian countries. I had a big program on the Middle East. And in case you haven't noticed, the Middle East is the one region of the world that has not a single liberal democracy. And it constantly weighs on me, in part because I'm the editor of the Journal of Democracy. I should be somebody who is full of moral righteousness about working in places that are autocratic. But I see that when Harvard goes to China or when Harvard goes to other authoritarian countries in my part of the world, it has enormous convening power, enormous prestige, and it's able to open the space for free discourse in those places. Okay, in China, I could probably convene a conference on democracy and the meaning of democracy at Harvard's office in China, and the Chinese government would probably not molest me. And that might have a small but nonetheless measurable impact on broadening the space for academic freedom in those places. So I'm all for engagement with those places. What I worry about is their impact on us when they come here. Okay, and so I am very concerned about students in my classroom being subject to or fearful of informants. I've seen that. I'm very concerned about students from authoritarians who have learned the techniques of our students about how you claim harm and you claim violence because a professor said your country has a bad human rights record. You say, I couldn't sleep. This literally happened to me once. I couldn't sleep. I'm not able to do my work because the professor denigrated my country. I'm very worried about that. But I think, again, the solution for that is for us to be in institutions where our administrations say, defend to the hilt our right to speak and where we protect our students' right to speak. So anyways, those are my 3 contributions. Those are great questions.
Like to respond now? We have, or we can take, if there's another question in the audience, someone okay, yes.
Well, I thought it was a fascinating presentation, and I certainly learned a great deal both about the origins of academic freedom in the human rights discourse and so on. And I also admire the ambition of the project. But I think that perhaps it's too ambitious, and here's why. Okay, and this is partly, I mean, you must be familiar certainly with the complaints that the Indian government and people in India have with VDEM. And the idea essentially is that there's not as much democratic backsliding in these VDEM, in actuality, as the VDEM indicator suggests there is. So if you look at VDEM's index of polyarchy, which is a measure of political competition, India today is less democratic than the US in 1919, when African Americans did not have the ability to vote, women did not have the ability to vote. It's less democratic than in the emergency period, which was in the 1970s, when elections were suspended, the entirety of the opposition was in jail, hundreds of thousands of people were forcibly sterilized, right? Mm. So it was literally an authoritarian system. And the reason why this matters for your measures of academic freedom is because at the end of the day, they are still just expert surveys, right? And you're asking people to go back 100 years and think about what academic freedom looked like back then. And is it really feasible to do that, right? Is it really possible to know when, say, there were 1,000 graduate students in the whole country of India, right? To compare that moment in time to today, and actually have a meaningful comparison. And one of the things I learned in graduate school was it's possible as a social scientist to both add to human knowledge, but it's also possible to subtract from human knowledge.
That's mainly what social scientists do.
Yeah, yeah. And so this is a big risk, right? Because in trying to do so much, you might actually be doing less. And the reason I think that this is also important is because we don't know a whole lot about who the coders are, what their biases are. And VDEM's methodology, it helps to some extent in doing that by comparing across countries, but the whole thing is kind of a black box, right? And when we speak about one of the complaints, I think, in India, is just a matter of positionality, where you have elites in Western countries deciding what democracy should look like in the rest of the world, right? So I think there are two solutions to this problem. One,
I'm actually going to have, because we're running out of time, and I need to give Katrin the last word.
Sure, but okay. I'm just gonna finish my one. Right? I mean, one solution might be to corroborate it with some objective measures. For example, do academics write op-eds at higher or lower rates that take the opposite line against the government, right? And I certainly concede that there is a constraining of the civic space in large parts of the world, right? Or alternatively, maybe just reduce the time span of the data collection effort. Though, of course, I admire the ambition, and I think it's very important.
Hey, so you have the last word.
Yeah, these were great comments, and I really appreciate that we have some critical debate going on, because that's what academic freedom really should. You're right that the coders are anonymous. Anybody can apply to be a coder. In fact, I always encourage people after listening to me to check out the VDEM website and to please apply to be a coder, especially if you disagree with the scores, right? I think together we can make the data better. But there are limitations to the data, and India is a very good example. We have, of course, a margin of error and a confidence level, right? Where when you compare it, for example, to the emergency or to other countries, maybe it doesn't look so dramatically wrong. But the questions you're asking are absolutely right, and they point to a key challenge when you produce comparative data. How do you ensure comparability, right? And would we feel more comfortable if we knew the coders? Maybe. Now we have to trust, and I have to trust. I don't know all the coders, right? I have to trust the selection committee doing its job properly. Doubt that adhering to academic standards, but there is an element of trust, right? Now, that is only related to their names. You can, of course, see the coder disagreement in the data, and there is coder disagreement also on India, right? And there should be. And India is a particularly difficult country to code because it's so large. There is huge differences at subnational level, and we just have one score for the whole country, right? Compare that to a small country like Luxembourg, right? So yes, there is a margin of error, and we need to treat the data carefully, therefore. I don't believe that there are any other objective measures because it's a latent variable. If you have ideas, I'd be really interested in exploring, but the events data, any type of events data on op-eds or dismissals or imprisonment of scholars or closure of universities or recordings of classroom discussions and so on, faces a myriad of information bias problems, right? That I think are much greater and more difficult to correct than what we currently have with the coders. However, like you, I am concerned about recency bias. Does sort of an experience that we are going through a certain period of time influence the coders' behavior when they code backwards? And in particular, how accurate is it to go back 100 years? Well, the coders are usually different. We involve historians to code the earlier periods. But I also have some concerns about this, which is why, if you noticed, I showed you only data starting from the 1960s and not going all the way back. In a collaborative project of this kind, sometimes one has to accept decisions taken by others prior to one's own involvement. And I think by and large, I think a lot of great decisions have been taken in the VDM project. I'm not sure I would code back to the 1900s. We have insisted in the Academic Freedom Index that we only code countries where universities existed, right? So prior, the indicator on academic expression, for example, was coded even for countries in years where there was no single university. And I thought that really didn't make any sense. So before starting the Academic Freedom Index, we collected data on the existence of universities. Before that, you don't have to speak about academic freedom. So these are some interesting details that I think one has to get right and improve on. Now, my last point will, of course, be on why we need an Academic Freedom Index, in addition to talking about freedom of opinion, right? And why do I care about it?
Help me understand the distinction.
So, first of all, I wouldn't argue, and I'm German, so I feel much more comfortable with restrictions on freedom of expression than probably most people in the United States. It's not an absolute right. Academic freedom is not an absolute right. They're not different in that sense. For both of these rights, there are legitimate limitations. The limitations are, however, different, and the reasons for these limitations are different. Again, academic freedom doesn't protect any kind of speech, right? It protects academics to express themselves not on opinions, but on scholarly work. Well, that's an area where we need debate, but academics, when they claim their authority and claim academic freedom, they also have to produce some evidence that they're not only presenting us with opinions. Of course, they're free like any person to hold opinions and to publicize them, but to have an additional right where we say this is of particular importance to democracy, right? We need to distinguish between scientific discourse, scientific results, and opinion anybody can hold. And I think it's particularly important at a time where we have to deal with alternative facts and all sorts of claims that really we should be able to distinguish and continue to insist that there's a difference. And that's why we need universities and scholars to do that job.
I want to thank Katrin Kinzelbach. I want to thank Professor Sheikh Massoud. And I want to thank excellent questions from the audience for very stimulating.